you. Today, the title of my presentation is The Aesthetics of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and the subtitle is The Great Culture of Synthesis, because I think that the architecture, the art, and all the expression of all the artistic expression are related to our senses. So we are talking about the aesthetics because we are talking about the sensible approach that the architecture in this case has with the senses. So for introduce the Charles Rennie Mackintosh figure is very interesting to do an analysis and a presentation in 2021 of this great master of the architecture, but also of the decoration, of the artistic expression of liberty movement and the modern movement too. And Macintosh, born in Glasgow in 1868, and he died in London in 1928. But he has a life very intensive, and I think that his approach to the art, to the reality, was ever related to the sense of the true. And we will see together how this big sense of the true is related to his architecture and furniture and expression of aesthetics. So this presentation will be divided in four topics. So the first one is the biography through his works, and the second one is the great work that he had with the building of the Glasgow School of Art, and the third one is his approach, is about his approach with the arts and the craft. So his sensible approach with the materials and also with the elements of architecture and of the design. And at the last, we will have the fourth point, that is the aesthetics thought. So we can talk about an aesthetics thought in Charles Rennie Mackintosh, of course. So the first topic is about his life, and Mackintosh was born in Parsons Street in Glasgow, and his father was a policeman. So it didn't was it was a part of the middle class, I think, and the context, the historical context when he born is related to the age of Klimt, of Munch, of Hofmann. So we can say that Mackintosh born in the age of the liberty, and after few years after, we will have the modern movement with Le Corbusier, Gropius, Mies and Klee. So I think that the historical context of Mackintosh is between the liberty movement and the modern movement. But the historical context is related to the theoretical context, and in the age of Mackintosh, so in the early century, we have two personality very important for these years, that were William Morris and John Ruskin. And the first topic of this culture, of this great culture of the early century, was related to the new relationship between craftsmanship and machine. So the aesthetic approach, the aesthetic movement related to the architecture, to the decoration, to the craftsmanship, is related to the machine. And the first engage that Mackintosh has at the age of 16 years is in the John Atkinson studio, and in the same year, in 1884, he begins evening classes at the Glasgow School of Art. And in the same context, in the 1889, Mackintosh became a draftsman at the Honeyman and Kippy studio, and for him, this passage is very important because this studio of Honeyman and Kippy represent in the early century in Glasgow represents this new movement, this new cultural movement of the aesthetics, architecture, design, and the decoration also. At the same time, he met three important persons that were Herbert McNair, Margaret MacDonald, and Frances MacDonald. And Margaret MacDonald was the wife of became the wife of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So he began to work with these three personalities that are very engaged in this historical context in the early century. Really engaged with all these movement related to the approach of the architecture. That was an approach very sensible and at the same time very sensible to all the expression of art. So when we talk about the architecture of Mackintosh, we are talking about a total expression of an artistic total expression of his work. And after a few years, in this group was named the Group of Four because there began this work of this approach of this sensible approach to the aesthetic architecture. And in 1899, Glasgow, the Mackintosh won the Glasgow Design Prize, and he won another prize, very important, that was a scholarship that permits to Mackintosh to take a trip in Italy, and he took a tour of Italy in 1891, and in 1896 he participated to the competition of the Glasgow School of Art building, and in 1897 he won this competition. So you can see that in the first part of his life, how Mackintosh was involved in this Glasgow, in this Scottish cultural movement. So we will see how Mackintosh was very related to the commitment, to his commitment, and to some personality that introduced him with the European cultural movement. And in this context, in this historical context, we have some journals of this period that published some works and some text by Mackintosh. The first one is the journal The Studio. It was an English journal of 1893, and you can see that in this magazine the illustration, the decoration, the architecture, the design are involved in the same context, and this is very important. The second one, for example, we have Pan, that it was reviewed, that it was a journal, German journal, or for example the Jugend and the Simplissimus. Also, we have some French journal like Art et Décoration, that was a journal of the modern art, and the Kunst und Kunsthandwerk in Austria, so in Vienna, and the Russian too, the Russian side too. We have the Mir Iskutsia of 1899. So in this context, Mackintosh began his work of architect, of designer, of craftsman. And the first project by Macintosh was the Windhill in Kilmacolm, and the commitment was William Davidson. And this is a sketch from the outside of this building, and after we will see the interiors. A second personality that take Macintosh in the European culture, in the European movement, was Miss Creston. And Miss Creston was like a mecenate in Glasgow, and he has some tea rooms. And the first one that Macintosh project was the tea room in Ingram Street. This is a panel from Mackintosh and McNair, and is a representation of a room, of a music room for the Viennese Secession exhibition. So Macintosh in the early century began his work with the Viennese context. And you can see in this representation how Macintosh conceived the interior space. The decoration is part of architecture, and this is the first meaning of his aesthetics approach, his sensible approach, because all the elements of his furniture, his representation of the space representation, all the elements are part of one element of the project. And this is a picture from this exposition, this exhibition in the early century. And you can see in this picture, for example, the chair and the mirror glass and some stencil and all the furniture that is related to some symbolic appreciation, for example, of the nature, or symbols from the nature, from the landscape, from the reality. So Macintosh has this sensibility to represent the ambience, the atmosphere through this symbolic way. And his production spread to Vienna because he was in contact with Joseph Hoffmann, that it was the secretary of the Vienna secession. So he worked a lot in Vienna in the first years of the 19th century. And the second part of his life is very strange, because he became partner of Honeyman and Kippy, but he left Honeyman and Kippy 10 years after, and he moved to London in 1950, and from 1933 to 1937 he lived in Port-Vendresse, so in the south of France, and he died in London. So in this part of his life, he finished his work of architecture and of designer. And this is very strange. We will see how Macintosh express himself through the watercolors and through other projects. And the first project that I want to introduce you is the project of his home in Main Street in Glasgow. And this interior, you can see, this is the dining room. It was the dining room of Macintosh. And in this interior, you can see how the texture of the wood, the color of the wood is related to the color of the stencil on the walls. And this is, I think, the great element aesthetics, of the aesthetics of Macintosh, of the aesthetic of the architecture aesthetics of Macintosh, because he says that all the elements are the main elements of the same architecture. So when we talk about architecture in Macintosh, we don't talk only about the project or only about the facade, but we are talking about all the elements of an architecture. And I think that this approach, this total approach to the architecture, I think is very, very actual for the designer too. So this was the living room, and you can see that all the chairs are different. So all the elements are related to a main harmony that produce an atmosphere, an aesthetics atmosphere. And in this case, the lamps and the chairs and the table and all the elements of this room are related each one other. This is the bedroom with, of course, the bed and the glass mirror. And this is a chair from his house, and the name is armchair with stenciled high back. So you can see that we can't talk about only the decor, the decoration, and the art installation, for example, but we are talking about a total view of the architecture in this case, through all the elements that that represent the architecture and the craft. And Macintosh says every object which you pass from your hand must carry an outspoken mark of individuality. And for this reason, I say that every chair is different, because the mark of individuality is very, very important for Macintosh, because this mark of individuality is related to this iconic representation of the furniture. So the mark of individuality, the beauty, and the most exact execution. So the most exact execution is related to his past of craftsman. And for example, another exhibition that Macintosh represents in the early of the century was an exhibition in Italy, in Turin, and it was for the Scottish section for the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative Art. So we are talking about a decorative art, but this decorative approach is related to the design approach, of course. So in this case, Francis Newbery, that will be a great friend and a big personality, and it will represent a big influence for Macintosh in his life. Invited Macintosh for this Scottish section in the International Exhibition in Turin. And you can see here the decoration and the representation of the Rose Boudoir by Margaret MacDonald. So he worked a lot with his wife, and I think that is very interesting in this era of of the gender studies, talking about the women that were involved in the exhibition art and the art exhibition and the architectural exhibition, like also Margaret MacDonald. And a second work of this early age of his life is the Hill House. And the Hill House was committed by Walter Blackie, that it was an editor, Scottish editor. And this is the sketch of the outdoor and of the facade of the building. But we can see that in this interior, in the living room, how the decoration is related to the furniture, and the furniture is related to the interior architecture. So we have all the elements that represents one thing. All the elements create an atmosphere. And in this case, we can see also the furniture that is related to the stencil on the wall, and these stencil are related to the stencil on the sofa. So you can see how the details are involved in the main project, and how the main project is involved in the details. So we have all the elements that bring this question of sensible approach in the project and in design of by Mackintosh. This is the bedroom of Hill House, and in this bedroom, in this beautiful bedroom, I can say, we see this chair that today is an iconic chair. Here we have the table, one of the table of the living room. This is another picture of living room, and this is another room. This is the entrance of the Hill House, and it's very interesting to see how the soft colors of the interiors are opposite to the colors of the entrance. So it's very interesting how Mackintosh used the palette and the palette of colors for representing his interiors. And this is the chair of Hill House that in the contemporary era was reproduced by Cassina, that is an Italian fabric of furniture. And in this case, today, if you want some furniture by Mackintosh, you can buy in Cassina some chairs about his main project. So another project of this period is the Wheel of Tea Room, and I think that every Scottish, every person that lives in Glasgow knows the Wheel of Tea Room. That is now yet open, and these are some historical picture of some interiors of the ground floor, and you can see how the chairs are related to all these this decoration of the interiors. And this is a contemporary picture of another room of the same tea room, another interior, and you can see how the colors of all the furniture change. This is another historical picture, and this is a contemporary picture of this room. So this is another piece of furniture, very iconic, related to the Wheel of Tea Room, but also this one. But also this one is very iconic. So it's very interesting to see how some pieces of furniture of the early century can be in the contemporary age iconic, can be part of our living room. And the second point of my presentation today is about the Glasgow School of Art. So we had said that Macintosh won this competition in 1897, and Francis Newbery was the director of the Glasgow School of Art at the age of 30, and he was the appointed headmaster. And Francis Newbery was a great personality, great cultural personality of the early century in the Scottish culture and in the English culture too. So Macintosh began the work of the building of the School of Art, and in the early century, this is the sketch of the North Facade with the entrance. And some critics and some theorists say that this facade is the great example of the liberty movement, because we have all the elements that represent the scenes of architecture that Macintosh wants express for himself and for for the great culture of the early century. And this is another reproduction of the facade, and this is a picture from 1910. This is the entrance of Glasgow School of Art. And this is a painting that represents the building committee, and you can see some chairs designed by Macintosh, and this is a photo, so you can see that this furniture is related to all the project, to all the main project. And this is the interiors of the library, and it's very sad today to talk about this library burnout in 2 years ago, I think. So these are the lamps of the library, and you can see that that is a very strong relationship with the forms, the symbols of the chairs, for example, and of the materials, the lamps. And this is, for example, the sketch of the project of the library lamps. And this is the relationship between the lamps, these geometrical, these geometrical details of the interiors and the materials. So this is the clock of the library, and some furniture of the library. And this is a picture with the colors, so it's very clear and very related to this approach of the sense of a totality in architectural expression. This is a detail and is a swift from a cupboard in the director's office. So every door has some symbols in glass and in metal. And I think that the Glasgow School of Art represents today a big landmark of culture of the 19th century, but also at the same time is the great example of how a designer, an architect can approach to the aesthetic involvement. And for aesthetic involvement, I want to underline all the elements that represent the same thing. And in the arts and craft, also Macintosh produced many watercolors and textile design. And for example, here we have a great watercolor, and the title is "The Tree of Personal Effort." And is in couple with another watercolor that is one, the tree of influence. And you can see how the symbolism, how all the school of the decorative school and the art school are approached from Macintosh in the expression of art. And in the last year of his life, Macintosh paints some plants and some seeds, some fruit, because his relationship with the nature is very strong. And for example, here we have a great picture of the borage, or for example, the cactus flower. You can see how Macintosh express himself through this nature expression, nature symbolism. Also, we have the white roses. And this picture, I love so much this picture because it represents the ships, and for the greetings, for the Christmas greetings. And you can see the style is really changed from the first years of his watercolors. And in the last years, when he lived in the south of France, the landscape became the main subject of his representation, of his expression. And for example, here you can see all the stones represented by the colors and by his vision, his approach to the natural landscape. The little bay that is the port, in Port Vendresse, is the last watercolor of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And these are pictures of the design for textiles that Macintosh produced in the last years of his life. And you can see how this geometrical approach is related to a poetical approach, because you can see some symbolism and some colors used for the textiles, and all the geometrical approach are related to a conceptual approach. And this is the last, the rose and the teardrop that I love so much. So the last point of my lecture today is about the aesthetics thought, because we had seen how Charles Rennie Mackintosh represents his approach to the architectural reality, to the design reality, to the craftsmanship reality, etc. But what about the aesthetics thought? So we can talk about today about the aesthetics thought in Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And he wrote some text, a few texts in the first years of the 19th century. And in this book by Pamela Robertson, you can find some architectural papers by Mackintosh. So first of all, his approach to the architectural context, so his thought of the aesthetics and of the aesthetics in the architectural side are very influenced by John Ruskin. And John Ruskin represents for Mackintosh the great theorist of the art and of the architecture. And John Ruskin introduced this word, this concept about through. And through for Mackintosh is this approach to the reality from the scenes that you have, that you can have, and that you can express from your side. So the true in this case means this sensible approach to the reality and the expression through his work of the reality. Sorry. Another reference, very important, is from James Ferguson, that introduced this meaning of phonetic architecture. And in this case, if you can think about Libeskind, for example, that it was first of all a musician, composition, and after an architect. In this case, the interpretation of phonetic architecture is related to the architectural composition, like the music composition. So we are talking about an harmonic approach to the architecture and to the design. Also, another reference is Francis Newbery. And Francis Newbery took a conference from the Philosophical Society of Glasgow, sorry, and introduced the topic of the training of the architectural students. And if you can see, in the early century and the last year of the 18th century, we have this interdisciplinary, this pluridisciplinary approach from the architecture to the philosophy and vice versa. And I think that is very important, is very actual, this approach to give some fields of the human science in the architectural science, in the architectural way. So the two first texts that I want to introduce today are related to the tour in Italy, the Grand Tour. And often when we talk about the architecture and aesthetics in architecture, for example, in the work of Le Corbusier, we talk often about the voyage in Orient, so his experience in Italy. And before, 20 years before, Mackintosh came to Italy for his studentship, and took a tour for his experience, for his first experience like an architect and like an architecture student. And this trip became in Naples, so in the south of Italy, and he continues to the north. And it's very interesting because when Mackintosh described, for example, Naples, that is my city, he describes Naples with the Vesuvio and all the elements that represent a sensible approach to the city. He described the sea and the landscape and the people and all the feelings that he feel in Naples. But also in every city, he take note of his feelings and of his work, for example, of sketching. And he described often the Italian culture through the architectural approach. So he talked often about the Italian Gothic, but also the Baroque and the Classic, etc. And it's very interesting to read this text, because from this text we can have the sense of this first approach of Mackintosh to the architectural reality. And he says about Naples, I shall never forget waking up one morning and seeing Naples through the porthole of our cabin. I have no doubt that to most of you, this famous aspect of Naples is non-exist, but to realize of it, you must see it. So there is from Goethe culture to the actuality, this world of Naples that you have to see Naples and after you die. This context, this historical context, is very important to introduce some aspect of his tour in Italy. And about Venice, that is the city of John Ruskin, in the Venice Stone, that it was a text by John Ruskin. And John Ruskin often described, for example, the Palladio architecture. And in this case, in this quote, we can see an atmosphere that Mackintosh described of the Rialto. And he wrote, innumerable lights began to appear on the canal. Every boat had its lantern, and the gondolas moving rapidly along were followed by tracks of light which played and danced upon the waters. I was gazing in rapturous delight of those dancing fires when the sounds of music were wafted along the canal towards us. As they grew filled with musicians used from the Rialto. And this is an atmosphere that Mackintosh introduced, and with all the experience of this Italian tour. But also two other texts that I think are very important for this aesthetic approach of Mackintosh are the Untitled Paper on Architecture and the paper titled Architecture. So what about the approach, the theoretical approach of Mackintosh and architecture? And this is a paper to present some fields to the students. And he says, in this paper, I propose giving some of the elementary rules which govern true architecture, a knowledge of which is necessary to critique. For I do believe that most intelligent people desire the capacity of discriminating between the right and the wrong in architecture to the same degree, at least, as they do in painting, sculpture, or music, or poetry. So this is the totality for me. So this total side of the architecture. In the architecture, we have also the painting, the sculpture, the music, because we have the composition, the poetry, and all the expression, all the artistic expression. And he continues, to begin with is not building. To build, literally to confirm, is by common understanding to put together and adjust the several pieces of any edifice or receptacle of a considerable size. Thus, we have church building, house building, ship building, and coach building. So, to begin with is not building. The begin is this total side of the aesthetic expression. And he says that in architecture we can find three main elements, and the three main elements are the strength of stability, the utility, and the beauty. And the architecture then we find must serve mind and body. So this approach to serve mind and body is very important, because we have a human approach, a sensible approach to the architecture in this case. Mackintosh don't talk only about, for example, the utility, but he talked about the stability, of course, the utility and the beauty, but also the architecture must serve mind and body. So we have this total approach to the architecture, and I think that is the main topic of his aesthetic approach to the architecture and to the architectural theories. So the first one, the stability, is the quality or condition, refers to good, sound, practical workmanship in all the materials, in all the materials, which materials must vary with the locality. And this is, I think, another main element, because, for example, when we read some text from Peter Zumthor or Juani Pallasma, that are the contemporary architect of the atmosphere and of the phenomenology in architecture, we can read about this relationship with the element. So the relationship for the architect with the element and the materials, but also these materials must vary with the locality. So, you know, every place has its identity, and this identity is based on the historical context, the social context, but also is based on the architectural or the urban context. And the materials, the local materials, are the base of this identity. So this condition of stability is related to the condition of the locality, the materials locality. The second one is utility. And in this example, Mackintosh take example from the Greek, and he says, for in Greek, while the temple was certainly far before all other edifices in importance, and so had the Acropolis, and so had the greatest artistic care lavished upon it. Theaters, distinctly different in every requirement, were yet noble monuments, while be private dwelling through singular plane, which there can be doubt, as well as being comfortable, their primary object substantial and at the same time pleasing to the eye. So the utility is related to the pleasure in this case. And this is a second topic I think that is very important for give us this context of aesthetics in Macintosh. The utility have to be pleasure for the eye and for all the senses. So this is the meaning for Macintosh of the architecture, this total meaning, this total sensibility of the reality that surrounds us. And the beauty. The beauty is another thing that is very, very important. And he says, he takes an example from the ladies at the School of Art. The general impression seems to be that it is the peculiar inheritance of gentle blood and independent all training that while a young lady is devoting at school or under governess, so many hours a day to music, so many to language, and so many to general science, she is all the time unconsciously forming that sense of the beautiful which we call taste. That is, the sense once developed will enable her, unassisted by any special study or experience, not only to appreciate the charms of nature in every aspect. So Mackintosh introduced the element of taste, the element of the sense, but also the element of unconsciousness. And this unconsciously is very important to give us this aesthetic approach, because, you know, when we talk about the aesthetics, we are talking about a Greek word that is aesthesis. Aesthesis meaning sense. And in this case, our sensitive approach is unconsciousness, but also we can study for have a taste of these senses. So the first approach is related to the sense and is the same meaning that, for example, Zumthor and Pallasma gives to the phenomenological approach in architecture, or for example, Stephen Hall. So I think that is very contemporary, this approach to the sensible architecture and the sensible approach to architecture. So he says, pleasure to the mind is desired besides comfort and protection to the body. And this double service is accomplished by architecture. So the architecture is a service for the body, the mind, and the pleasure of the mind, and the comfort and protection of the body. And I think that is all the architectural students must read this sentence, because the first approach of the project must be our sensation of a place, or a space. And I think that in this double view of the pleasure and the protection is related to the utility service of architecture. So the architecture is based on the pleasure and the protection. And the last test that I want to introduce is the last test, the last text wrote by Macintosh in early 19th century. And the title is Similiness. And in this text, Macintosh introduced some elements about the design and the artistical approach to, for example, the materials. And in the introduction, he wrote, I have chosen as my theme similarness, but the theme will often be lost in my wanderings, will sometimes be only faintly heard in variation. I want to speak to you only as artist, so not only as architect. And if anything I say has already been said by any of you, I want to speak on the possible improvement in the design of everything. So this is a main topic of the design of everything, because we can't talk about only the project of a building, for example. We are talking about the design of everything, all the elements of the furniture, all the decoration, etc. On the possible improvement in the education of work of architect and craftsman and artist. So the architect, the craftsman, and the artist are in the same level. To insist on some artistic intention being evident in the making of adornment of each article of everyday use. And this is a vision. You know, in the design context, we talk often about the future design. And this is the future design, because it's a vision of each article of everyday use. So the everyday use, the daily object have to be aestheticized. So the aesthetics of everyday, for example, you know, I'm sure by Yuriko Saiko, the everyday aesthetics theories. And from Yuriko Saito, we have some studies about the everyday aesthetics related to design, to the design. So the everyday use is related to the beauty. So is a such of democratic thought about the design approach, about the architectural approach, about the artistic approach. And this everyday use, I think, is a main character of the architecture, of the artistic expression in Macintosh, because we had seen that every room has its decoration, has its individuality, but also every element has its individuality. And he says, the man with no conviction, no ideals in art, no desire to do something personal, something is known, no longing to do something that will leave the world richer, his fellows happier, is no artist. The artist who thinks personal conviction, who lives not up to his ideals, is no man. And this is the main concept of the true concept by John Ruskin. This is the true concept. The artist who thinks personal conviction, who lives not up to his ideal, is no man. And he says, the only true modern individual art in proportion, form, and in color is produced by an emotion, produced by a frank and intelligent understanding of the absolute and true requirements of a building or object, a scientific knowledge of the possibility and beauties of material. And in this sentence, we have all the work of Macintosh, because we have this proportion, form, and color that are produced by emotion, so produced by our feeling, but also produced by a frank and intelligent understanding of the absolute and the true requirements of a building or object. And this is the total vision of the aesthetics of Macintosh, because here he talks about the building at the same level of an object. So this approach, this aesthetic approach by Macintosh, is for all the elements of his expression, a scientific knowledge of the possibilities and beauties of material. So here in this sentence, we have all, I think, all the work of Macintosh. And at the least, he says, the artist may gather form, a close, careful study of old work, a great deal that will refine his tastes, that will help him to a more adequate appreciation, and therefore a fuller enjoyment of art and nature and life. So the artist may gather form, and the artist, the real artist, have to speak with the future, the present, and the past. And he says that the appreciation, our senses, our sensible approach to the reality, so our enjoyment of art, is related to our enjoyment to the nature and the life. And I think that this is the great lesson of Charles Rennie Mackintosh today, because from the past and from the future vision, we can have today the really meaning of the aesthetics in architecture, and the really meaning of this sensitive approach to the project. So when I talk about the aesthetics in architecture, I talk about this sensitive approach to the reality and to the project. And thank you for your attention, and please support the Glasgow School of Art. Thank you so much for your attention.